June 1944. The D-Day landings on the beaches of Normandy. Despite the massive Allied invasion, it takes nearly a full year to win the war. Adolf Hitler refused to accept defeat. As the Third Reich collapsed around him, the savagery and fanaticism of the Nazis only increased. Those 11 months, the most relentless and brutal period of World War II, leaves an everlasting scar on history. The summer of 1944. For nearly 5 years, Europe has been at war. On the 6th of June, on the evening of what is called the longest day, more than 150,000 Allied soldiers make it to land. By July, almost 1 million men are fighting in Normandy. The Allies have control over the skies and are systematically destroying the infrastructure used by the Germans. Their convoys of reinforcements are strafed. Even Field Marshal Rommel, the head of German forces in Normandy, is wounded in an aerial attack. A joke makes the rounds in the German ranks. If you see a white plane, it's an American one. If you see a black plane, it's an English one. And if you see nothing, it's the Luftwaffe. Still, Hitler's armies are putting up fierce resistance. British Field Marshal Montgomery expects to take the port city of Caen within a day. It takes 6 weeks, and carpet bombing flattens the city. In the final week of July, the front gives way. The Americans manage to break through on the Cotentin Peninsula. Allied troops liberate Brittany as General Patton's rampaging 3rd U.S. Army liberates town after town and pushes east. The liberation of Western Europe is underway. And the war-torn population has hope that the end is near. The mood is confident. We'll cut through Germany like butter, predicts those around Supreme Allied Commander General Eisenhower. The optimism is intensified by a huge offensive underway on the Eastern Front as the Red Army seizes Belarus from Nazi forces. Vitebsk, Orsha, Mogilev, Babrusk, Minsk. One by one, the cities of Belarus fall. Vasily Grossman, correspondent for the Soviet Army newspaper The Red Star, notes, "Here the cauldron of death boils, swallowing up in merciless vengeance all those who have not laid down their weapons and fled west." To slow the Russian advance, the Germans carry out a scorched earth policy, ravaging towns and destroying the infrastructure. But nothing, not blown up bridges or thousands of landmines, can stop the advance of Joseph Stalin's Red Army. Their progress is so rapid that they're running out of fuel. So Russian soldiers sometimes mix vodka and diesel oil to keep the tanks rolling. One German corporal writes to his wife, "If the Russians continue in this direction, you won't have to wait long before they're on your doorstep." On July 17, 1944, Stalin parades 57,000 German prisoners through Moscow to celebrate one of the biggest defeats inflicted on the German army. 3 years earlier, Hitler had promised them they would march through Moscow. A promise ironically fulfilled. Attacked from the west by the British, American and Canadian forces, and from the east by the Soviets, the Reich is threatened with collapse. Convinced of their imminent defeat, a circle of German officers plot to eliminate Hitler so they can open negotiations with the Allies. On the 20th of July, while the Führer is meeting with his top brass, a bomb goes off. The blast causes massive damage. But Hitler miraculously survives, suffering only a burst eardrum. Not everyone is so lucky. Several men who are with him are gravely wounded and later die. That same day, Benito Mussolini, who still reigns over the northern half of Italy, pays him a visit. As Hitler shows him the location of the attack, he says, "The bomb exploded just by my feet. It's clear nothing can happen to me. I am more certain than ever that the great cause which I serve will triumph despite the current dangers." Mussolini doesn't contradict him. Before leaving, he tells Hitler, "After this miracle, it is unthinkable that our cause might fail." When the German people learn that Hitler has survived, many weep with joy. They still believe their Führer represents their only hope of winning. The same evening of the assassination attempt, the dictator addresses his people.
Ein ganz kleiner Flügel verbrecherischer Elemente, die jetzt unbarmherzig ausgerottet werden. Es hat daher jeder Deutsche ganz gleich, wer er sein mag, die Pflicht, diesen Elementen nur mehr sofort rücksichtslos entgegenzutreten, sie entweder sofort zu verhaften oder wenn es irgendwo Widerstand leisten soll, sofort niederzumachen.
The attempt on his life increases Hitler's tendency toward paranoia. 5,000 people are arrested, followed by swift trials. Certain generals, impeccably dressed a few weeks earlier, appear before the judges in shabby clothes, looking dirty and haggard. Judge Freisler, a fanatical Nazi, showers them with insults. He shouts so loud that the technicians responsible for the recording ask him to bring the volume down. The sentence given is final.
Verräter an allem, wofür wir leben und kämpfen, werden Sie alle mit dem Tode bestraft. Ihr Vermögen verfällt dem Reich.
Some 200 people are executed. Following this purge, Germans become more zealous to avoid being suspected of disloyalty by pledging allegiance to the Führer to the bitter end. In the army, the Heil Hitler salute replaces the traditional military salute. Hitler then places his most trusted men in the top posts. Heinrich Himmler, head of the SS, is appointed head of the replacement army, giving him authority over nearly 2 million men. Goebbels, the Minister of Propaganda, becomes the Minister for War. Pleased with his promotion, he confides to his friends, "It takes a bomb under his ass to make Hitler see reason." The bombing hasn't broken the regime. It has empowered it. In the summer of 1944, for many Germans, the war is still distant. This swimming scene, filmed in August, is in the town of Dachau. A few miles away, the oldest concentration camp in Germany continues to slaughter prisoners arrested from across Europe. While Germans bask in the summer sun, occupied Europe remains in the cruel shadow of the Nazis. Germany continues to pursue its policy of annihilation. Between May and July, more than 435,000 Hungarian Jews are sent to the death camps. In August, the crematoriums at Auschwitz can't keep pace with the number of bodies piling up. The SS burns them in open pits. Even as the Allies approach Paris on the 17th of August 1944, a last convoy of prisoners leaves the region for the death camps. A week later, on the 25th of August, Paris is liberated. The Americans parade triumphantly amid the cheers. The Parisian women show their euphoria.
Oh la la, good morning, mademoiselle. Oh la la, I go to l'opéra. Oh la la, je speak pas very well. Oh là là, c'est-il là ou pas là en souriant? La petite Parisienne dit gentiment, justement je vais par là. Oh, oh,
Many GIs think the worst is over, and defeating Germany is just a formality. Summer holds the promise of victory, but autumn will deliver a series of setbacks. Since the D-Day landings, Eisenhower hasn't trusted Britain's Field Marshal Montgomery, who has overseen a string of failures in Normandy, despite the losses. Montgomery demands to run operations against the Reich, placing all Anglo-American forces under his command. This demand is unacceptable to Eisenhower. To avoid putting all his troops under Montgomery, Eisenhower divides his forces into two groups. The first group is under Montgomery's command. It will attack north toward Belgium and the Netherlands with the objective of seizing the port of Antwerp. Once in Allied control, tanks and munitions can be shipped closer to the front. The second group, assigned to U.S. General Bradley, will attack to the east, backed by the armies of Generals Patton and Simpson. In September, things move fast. The British and Canadians under Montgomery continue their advance and take Brussels. In the Belgian capital, the population celebrates wildly, as Paris had done 10 days earlier. The next day, in Antwerp, the victors capture hundreds of prisoners, but don't know what to do with them. So the zoo is quickly reassigned. Although hailed by the Belgian authorities, Montgomery makes a critical mistake. His troops have taken the port of Antwerp as planned, but they neglect to clean out the islands and riverbanks that control its access. These remain held by the heavily armed German units. The result: no Allied shipping can use the port to supply the front. For the next 2 months, Allied troops have to break down German resistance through dangerous amphibious operations. The failed offensive costs the Allies 13,000 casualties, but it will take more than that to undermine Montgomery. He persuades the skeptical Eisenhower to give him all available resources for a huge parachute operation on Arnhem in the Netherlands, codename Operation Market Garden. On the 17th of September 1944, over 20,000 paratroopers and more than 13,000 troops in gliders take off for the Netherlands. It's the biggest airborne operation in history. The American, British, and Polish parachutists are dropped behind the German lines to take a series of bridges across the rivers Maas, Waal, and the Rhine. Once these bridges are secured, land troops can bypass the defenses of the Siegfried Line and invade Germany. Montgomery is sure the war will be won by Christmas. Unfortunately, the situation on the ground becomes tricky. The gliders land, but some crash. The drop zones are too far from their objectives. The Germans capture a glider and recover equipment and supplies. But more importantly, they also find a plan of the operation that an officer had taken with him against orders. When the 4th Parachute Brigade is dropped as reinforcements, its soldiers are shot out of the sky by Germans waiting for them on the ground. In the town of Arnhem, 2 Panzer tank divisions race toward the British paratroopers and surround them. After 5 days of tenacious fighting, Montgomery's soldiers are forced to surrender.
Für Sie ist die Operation Berlin, wie General Eisenhower dieses Unternehmen bezeichnet, zu Ende. Sie haben sich abermals damit abfinden müssen, dass der von Churchill für diese Tage festgesetzte Termin der deutschen Kapitulation nicht nur erneut auf unbestimmte Zeit vertagt werden musste, sondern niemals in Frage kommen wird.
Overall, the Allies lose more than 17,000 men and liberate only a part of the Netherlands. While Montgomery is stopped in the Netherlands, Bradley's U.S. forces make progress. In September, his troops reach the German town of Aachen. Hitler orders his forces to defend the town to the last bullet. The 1st U.S. Army takes the town street by street, house by house, in ferocious combat. "I don't understand," says one GI. "They know they will most likely get killed. Why on earth don't they just surrender?" After 5 weeks of fighting, more than 1,000 GIs are killed, but the town finally falls. For the first time, German civilians experience what many people across Europe felt when they were overrun by the Wehrmacht troops. The taking of Aachen is a symbol. It's the first German town to fall into Allied hands. but it's a long way from spelling victory. The Allies are stalling in the face of fierce German resistance. Montgomery failed in the Netherlands, and the port of Antwerp is still unusable. And hard-driving General George Patton, who is eager to keep his advance moving eastward, is deprived of fuel. "My men can eat their belts, but my tanks have got to have gas," he roars. Ironically, part of his fuel has been diverted to the British. By slowing down Patton, the Allies are unable to exploit the breakdown of the Western Front. The Germans have time to regroup and take up defensive positions beyond the Rhine. The Western Front is blocked. That war over by Christmas has all but evaporated. The war rages on. To the west, the Red Army is camped on the Vistula, and the Allied armies finally open the port of Antwerp. The Americans have reached the Rhine. The Reich is finally getting squeezed. But despite a two-front attack, the Nazi regime shows no signs of crumbling. On the contrary, the army blindly obeys its supreme leader. In December, Germany has been holding out on two fronts for almost 6 months. The Reich is wounded and bleeding. But on the economic level, the country redoubles its efforts to produce tanks, planes, submarines, and munitions. They realize they can't win the battle in terms of numbers, so the Germans employ new weapons, like remote-controlled miniature tank buster vehicles. And one-man torpedo submarines. Above all, Hitler puts great faith in what he calls miracle weapons. The V-1 flying bombs have been raining down on London since June, killing thousands of civilians. The V-2 is the first ballistic missile in history. For several years, they're secretly developed in the Reich's factories. In the fall of 1944, they're finally ready. These rockets can carry 1 ton of high explosives. Although these retaliatory weapons have a limited impact, they galvanize the Germans. One young man writes, "All we talk about is the V-2. Perhaps we can launch them against America. I'm sure that victory is ours." Germany's industrial prowess is due to one man, Albert Speer. The Führer's architect supervises this reorganization, which he characterizes as a miracle. Despite Allied bombardments, weapons production has actually increased. But this increase is due to one thing: slavery. The Reich exploits deportees, Jews, communists. There are also labor conscripts rounded up from across Europe. Prisoners of war are turned into workers. Almost 9 million men and women slave in atrocious conditions on behalf of the Reich. With this workforce, German industry can keep up with the war effort. The Reich is even able to go from being on the defensive to the offensive. On the Western Front, splitting the Allied forces in two has left the Ardennes dangerously ill-defended. That is where Hitler decides to strike. On December 16th, 1,900 artillery pieces open fire. The Battle of the Bulge has begun. The The element of surprise gives the German High Command an unexpected success. The Allies think they're dealing with a beaten army. Instead, they find themselves facing a fierce counterattack. For Hitler, it's a big gamble. He hopes this offensive will stabilize the Western Front and convince the British and Americans that they can never win. The advance is spectacular. One lieutenant writes to his wife, "You cannot imagine the days of glory that we're experiencing at the moment. It is as if the Americans cannot withstand the might of our thrust." The American lines are in chaos. German commandos disguised as American soldiers infiltrate Allied territory, switch road signs, and carry out sabotage. The GIs become suspicious of everyone and everything. They intercept vehicles and carefully check identity papers. They are instructed to ask questions that only an American can answer. Who is Donald Duck's girlfriend? What is Roosevelt's dog's name? In Bastogne, Belgium, the GIs are up against the Germans and the weather. Many die, frozen in their foxholes. Then, on December 23rd, the Germans look up at the sky in horror. The snow has stopped, replaced by American planes which pound the German positions. Patton's Third Army arrives to relieve the siege of Bastogne. Just in time. Hitler's gamble backfires. At the Führer's headquarters, the mood is one of concern. Hermann Göring suggests to Hitler that he should seek an armistice. "The war is lost," he explains. Hitler replies, "I forbid you to take any such decision on this point. If you disobey my orders, I'll have you shot." Hitler, wrapped up in his delusions, insists, "We will never surrender. We may go down, but we will take the world with us." Meanwhile, to the east, the Red Army takes back the initiative. Fresh supplies have reached the troops massed along the Vistula. This buildup hasn't gone unnoticed. In Germany, General Guderian sounds the alarm. He pleads with Hitler to regroup his troops on the Eastern Front to counter a Soviet attack. But Hitler will have none of it, scoffing at the supposed threat. "It's the biggest bluff since Genghis Khan. Who came up with this idiocy?" Even Himmler refuses to admit it. "You see, General, I don't think the Russians are going to attack." General Guderian tries desperately to convince his superiors. Hitler repeats, "This intelligence is completely idiotic. Whoever wrote it should be shut up in a lunatic asylum." Deaf to all advice, Hitler shuts himself into his own world. On the 17th of January 1945, the Red Army enters Warsaw. They find a ghost town. There's no one left to contest the authority of the new occupying force. The Polish communists have no trouble taking control. The Soviets parade in the capital to celebrate a victory that came a little too late. On January 27th, the Soviets discover the Reich's biggest secret: a camp the size of a town, surrounded by barbed wire. Auschwitz-Birkenau. The SS evacuated the camp just 10 days beforehand. All the guards have fled. The Soviets find 7,000 prisoners, abandoned. 7,000 survive. From more than 1 million people murdered. Before they leave, the Nazis try to erase evidence of their crimes. They blow up the gas chambers and crematoriums. These factories of death also form the center of a system of plunder. The shocked Soviets find hundreds of thousands of pieces of clothing and tens of thousands of shoes. In a shed, they discover 7 tons of human hair. In 15 days, the Soviets cover more than 200 miles. No one in the Nazi leadership anticipated such a rapid advance. The Red Army, enraged, shows some particularly barbaric behavior. Neighborhoods and villages are sometimes torched. Stalin's army plunders shamelessly. One Soviet soldier writes, "Pillows and feathers from mattresses are flying everywhere." Everyone from the foot soldier to the colonel is carrying away his plunder. This town has been crucified. Anyone suspected of being a Nazi is shot. Almost 100,000 Germans are summarily executed. To the west, there is one last hurdle for the Allies to cross. The last natural barrier in Germany, the Rhine. All the bridges have been destroyed by the Germans. Field Marshal Montgomery is still hoping to be first to cross the river, but the Americans beat him to it. An advanced unit of the 1st U.S. Army finds a bridge still standing at Remagen near Bonn. The Germans rigged it with explosives, but hadn't detonated them yet. The Americans immediately establish a bridgehead of the eastern bank of the river. Hitler is furious and orders the engineers whose charges had not exploded to be shot. Meanwhile, Patton sends his troops across the Rhine farther south at Oppenheim without notifying his superiors. He's already spreading panic in German territory. Farther south, the French forces also advance. They fight on German soil alongside the Americans. The Allies find a gaping breach. They can finally invade the Reich. This is good news for them, but not for Stalin. As soon as he hears about the Allies' progress, he orders General Zhukov to take Berlin as soon as possible to avoid the Americans from beating him to it. In mid-February, Churchill wants to bomb the city of Dresden as a show of strength to the Soviets. The city is consumed in a firestorm. In less than 24 hours, more than 25,000 inhabitants perish. A whole city with no war-related industry and no strategic importance is destroyed. But destroying Dresden means driving up the number of refugees and disrupting the movements of the German army. The Allied leaders may have felt some regret over Dresden, but not for long. Hitler's obstinacy drives him to maintain the bombing campaign, whatever the cost to his civilian population. At the end of March 1945, the Reich slips into chaos. The outcome of the war is no longer in doubt. The progress of the Allied armies to the west and the Soviets to the east lead Himmler to close the concentration camps, sending prisoners on a death march. The detainees are on the road to nowhere. The Nazis no longer have time to gas people, so they kill through cold and hunger. Those who can't keep up the pace get a bullet in the head. When the Allies liberate the camps, most of them are almost entirely empty. The Germans leave only prisoners considered too weak to be evacuated. In April, the Americans enter the Ohrdruf concentration camp, an offshoot of Buchenwald. Eisenhower is overwhelmed. "I have never had such a shock in my entire life," he confesses. Patton is physically sick near a shed. Eisenhower orders the population of the closest town to visit the camp. In front of a crematorium oven where they burned 200 bodies a day, women faint. But the officers insist that the Germans confront the horrors that unfolded on their doorstep. On a table stand lampshades made of human skin. There are tattooed skins that a camp official collected and shrunken heads. Trophies of Nazi barbarity. Discovering these horrors, one journalist writes, "The gates of hell had opened." Other camps are liberated, and more visits are imposed on local populations. Eisenhower declares, "People tell us that the American soldier doesn't know why he's fighting. Now at least he knows against who he is fighting." The discovery of the hell of the concentration camps is a shock to the entire world. For 10 months, the Reich has been shrinking. In April, its final act begins. Berlin, the last citadel, prepares for the ultimate battle. On the 12th of April, the Berlin Philharmonic Orchestra performs Wagner's Twilight of the Gods. Many Germans still have faith in their Reich. On the 16th of April, the biggest artillery barrage of the war begins. 1,236,000 shells are fired. The Soviet divisions attack from every side. The Russians have one objective, the Chancellery, under which Hitler's bunker is located. Each crossroads is defended, sometimes by young children. Hitler is sheltered in his bunker. In these last pictures of the dictator, filmed a month earlier, the censors cut a piece of film which is never shown at the time. Incapable of controlling himself, suffering from what looks like Parkinson's disease, Hitler is no more than a shadow. Still, at no point is there any question of surrender. And yet, some 75 miles away on April 25th in Torgau, the long-awaited day finally comes. Germany is cut in two. The Soviet and American armies meet up. At the same time in Italy, on April 27th, Mussolini is captured while trying to escape. He is shot. Then his body and that of his mistress are brutalized by the crowd. When Hitler learns of the death of Mussolini, he concludes, "Dead or alive, I don't want to fall into the hands of the enemy. After my death, my body is to be burned, and no one will be able to find it." On the 30th of April, deep in his bunker, Hitler commits suicide along with his wife, Eva Braun. His body is then burned by his chauffeur. For 12 years, the dictator ruled over Germany and dreamed of a 1,000-year Reich. The mirage disappears in the ruins of his capital. One last lie. The radio claims Hitler dies leading the heroic defenders of Berlin. Hitler's remains are finally discovered in a bomb crater. When he learns of the Führer's demise, Stalin exclaims, "That's the end of that bastard. A shame we didn't take him alive." The remains are secretly shipped to Russia. Soviet leaders who savor their victory, paying a visit to the beast's lair, know nothing of this epilogue. Before the war, Hitler promised the Germans, "Give me 10 years and you won't recognize Germany." He kept his word.